Good afternoon, everyone. Uh, I have the distinct pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker, who is a giant in the field of technology and is fighting for fairness and diversity. She hails from New York. She is Congresswoman Yvette D. Clarke of the Ninth District of New York. And we at Zinger News and the NNPA are very proud to have her as our keynote speaker. Congresswoman Clarke.
Let me thank you so much for your wonderful introduction, Andre. Greetings, everyone. I'm Congresswoman Yvette D. Clark, and I proudly represent New York's 9th Congressional District, that's Central and South Brooklyn. Let me first thank Zinger, the National Newspaper Association, and Hyundai for convening this dynamic conference. And let me give a special shout out to the New York Carib News, New York Amsterdam News, New York Beacon, the Daily Challenge, and the Afro-American Times, Black newspaper publications from my home state of New York. I am also so thrilled to be here with you to discuss a most pressing issue, diversity and inclusion in the tech industry. As the founding co-chair of the Congressional Multimedia Caucus, which is dedicated to advancing issues related to diversity and inclusion in the media, telecom, and tech industries, I can tell you, I'm so proud to see this convening of Black media outlets focused on diversity and inclusion. For decades, Silicon Valley and the tech giants have played an increased role in influencing how we conduct business, communicate with one another, and explore the world around us. From innovations that have kept us connected across the globe in times of isolation to providing essential life-saving services, there is no doubt that big tech will shape our society for generations to come. Now, for those of you who are familiar with my legislative goals in Congress, it will come as no surprise when you hear that I consider diversity in the tech industry to be one of the most critical issues facing the now generation and the next. From combating algorithmic bias, preserving cyber civil rights, and combating the threat of cyber xenophobia, cyber racism, and cyber terrorism. But let me be very clear. All these threats are real, and I'm dedicated to fortifying and diversifying the frontier that is the tech industry. Because when an industry is as extensive and influential as big tech, and when the decisions that come out of that industry affect the lives of all of us, each of us has a role to play, a role in shaping our future. Today's youth should have an opportunity to shape the future they wish to live in by having access to opportunities within the tech industry, or for that matter, whichever sector they should choose. Far too often, when we hear calls for diversity and inclusion, these calls come up empty. We see vague hopes to increase representation policy without real action. Ladies and gentlemen, I tell you that the stakes are too high for this to be the case. We cannot have a future where a non-representative minority of American population calls the tech industry shots. Privilege should not be a prerequisite for making an impact. And that is why we must get to work immediately. Already, I'm working closely with organizations such as this one to monitor the progress we have made in promoting diversity in the tech industry. I encourage you to join me in my quest for diversity and inclusion in the tech industry. Black newspapers like yours play a critical role in disseminating information and preserving our culture. Your platforms uplift Black voices in the tech industry and drive attention towards innovation and inclusion. With your help, we can get to work immediately, implementing programs that connect disadvantaged youth to training programs, job opportunities, entrepreneurial opportunities, while tackling the ever-present digital divide. This will create new pathways to industries formerly controlled and accessed by the elite. To be blunt, this will not be easy work. It takes years of work to reverse deep-rooted trends of discrimination and other forces that have prevented diverse individuals from breaking into the technology sector. But as I said earlier, the stakes are too high, and we must ensure that women and people of color have a seat at the table, not just at a ceremonial center, but at the head. That allows for diverse voices to influence the technology industry's direction. And as a Black woman in Congress, I'm uniquely familiar with the tools we have at our disposal, and I will fight to make sure we utilize them every chance we get. So let me just thank you so much for having me here today to just share these thoughts with you. Thank you for being here today. Stay strong, stay healthy, stay safe, and stay blessed. And remember, wear your mask. Thank you. I'm Congresswoman Yvette D. Clarke, proudly representing New York's 9th Congressional District, and that's Central and South Brooklyn. I currently serve as chair of the Homeland Security, Cybersecurity, Infrastructure and Protection and Innovation Subcommittee under the jurisdiction of the House Committee on Homeland Security, and I previously served as co-chair of the Committee on Energy and Commerce, where I founded the Racial Disparities Working Group. Because let me be very clear, people of color in America are disadvantaged every day in countless ways, whether it be algorithmic bias, workplace inequality, cyber racism, and so many other disparities. Our task force has focused on uncovering the causes and finding solutions to what can often be non-obvious for reasons that we have individuals in our communities speaking for our communities, but not coming from our lived experiences. Why Black and Brown people are at the disadvantage compared to their white counterparts in industries such as tech is what we're diving into. Our country is ready for change. We're in the midst of it. We are seeing it from coast to coast. And that is part of the reason we are here today convening this very distinguished panel of dynamic Black women in the tech industry. We have representatives from government, private, and public sectors, and I am so pleased to be joined by the outstanding panelists. And let me just relay their names to you. We have former FCC Commissioner Mignon Clyburn, Director of the Center for Technology and Innovation and co-editor of Chief of Tech Think, Dr. Nicole Turner Lee, Vice President of Regulatory Affairs at NBC Universal, Angela Ball. But before we get started, I want to thank Zanger and the NNPA for hosting this event. There are distinct racial disparities in the tech industry, which plague Black women at a dramatically disproportionate rate in the tech industry. So let's jump right in. First up, FCC Commissioner Mignon Clyburn. The daughter of Congressman Jim Clyburn, Mignon served as commissioner of the FCC from 2009 to 2018. And throughout her tenure as a commissioner, Commissioner Clyburn fought to preserve net neutrality in the United States and mounted a vigorous defense of the FCC's pro-consumer policies. She has a long and very distinguished career in the Utilities and Public Service Commission, but she's just an all-around outstanding sister. Having said that, I'd like to introduce Commissioner Clyburn and ask, in your role as FCC Commissioner, what does the FCC Commissioner do? And what major barriers would you say you've had to overcome in and prior to this role?
Congresswoman Clark, first let me thank you, Zinger News and NPA for having me here today. An FCC Commissioner interprets and administers the authority you grant, meaning Congress grants, to regulate interstate and international communications. As one of 5 commissioners for over 8 years, I had a major role in regulating. Now, all of these aren't created equal, but regulating in different ways: radio, television, telephone, satellite, and cable industries. The FCC is an independent agency, and it rarely gets enough attention or credit, I believe, as being a major driver in most things broadband and access to the internet. The responsibility that holds fuels technological innovations that enable telehealth, virtual exchanges like what we're having now, and distance learning for those unable to attend school in person. In 2009, I became the first African-American woman appointed to the FCC. And in 2013, the first woman to head the agency when I served as interim chair. This all happened without a law degree. I have none, which is an anomaly in the federal communications space. Being a woman and person of color, 2 additional anomalies in the communications and technology space. And yes, I'm a DC outsider. I'm sitting in South Carolina, and before I got to the FCC, I often said I hadn't spent more than 2 weeks outside of South Carolina. But when it comes to these federal boards and commissions, the FCC is not alone when you speak about a lack of diversity and inclusion. All of this lack thereof perpetuates a lack of familiarity and a lack of upward mobility across the communication spectrum. People work in and around these industries have become accustomed and comfortable with homogeneity. And that lack of access, or this lack of access, just causes a very unsettling acceptance of this, and it fuels a lot of stagnation. So I say, our very existence amplifies and personifies the main challenges that we have in the communications and technology space, and that is a lack of representation.
Well, thank you so much. You put your finger right on the pulse of it, and we truly appreciate your contributions, Commissioner, being sometimes the only woman and the only person of color in the room. We know that our perspective was embodied in what you brought to the table. We thank you for your service. Next up, we have Dr. Nicole Turner Lee. She is a senior fellow in governance studies, the director of the Center for Technology Innovation, and serves as co-editor-in-chief of Tech Tank. It's a tongue twister. Dr. Lee researches public policy designed to enable an equitable access to technology across the United States and to harness its power to create change in communities across the world. Her work also explores global and domestic broadband deployment and internet governance issues. Welcome, Dr. Lee.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you for being with us. We want to ask you, what would you say is the most prescient issue plaguing Black women in the tech industry, and how do we combat it?
Yeah, well, first and foremost, I also want to send thank you to the host of this event. And Congresswoman, you're one of my favorite people. And you got 2 of my other favorite people on this event as well, which is Commissioner Clyburn and Angela. So I think this is an all-star lineup. Let me say this in terms of, what are some of the things plaguing Black women? And I sort of want to pick up on the question that you asked the commissioner around, what do you do, right? And really, why is it, particularly Congresswoman, that we don't have enough Black women in these spaces in technology that are basically reframing how we conduct and engage in business in our society, how we learn, how we live, and oftentimes how we love, right? Why are we not fully represented as Black women? And I would just suggest that, there are three things that are actually happening. I mean, the first thing is that we're not, necessarily in the boardroom or the C-suites when it comes to these corporations. And as a result of not having a seat at the table, oftentimes we're not able to either bring people in
Mhm.
or we're not able to be part of the production process and the ideas that actually come out of products that we ultimately consume, right? And so there's a problem with that for Black women, and that plagues us because that means that there are not products and services that are designed to us. You look at things like facial recognition technology, which I know you care about, Congresswoman. It still does not recognize Black women who change their hair. And I know Commissioner Clyburn pretty well. She shaves her hair often, like myself. And so, the fact that you don't have a technology that recognizes our versatility and flexibility is problematic. I think the other issue that plagues Black women is our narratives. They're silenced, right? They're not part of the mainstream storytelling of who we are. And I know Angela's going to talk about that. We don't have a chance to speak about what it means to be a Black woman in America. We're oftentimes, put to the side or interpreted as a supportive part of this rather than being, leading the narrative and driving the narrative. And that matters. Look at yourself as a member of Congress. Look at Vice President Harris. These are Black women who are doing tremendous things, and we should not necessarily be resigned to not having those narratives shared. We are the hidden figures that are now visible, and that has to actually play out. And I would just say the third thing that affects Black women, and I'll just say this as a single mother of two, we don't have the family supports oftentimes to consider ways to navigate in those spaces. Whether it's the family supports, the wage inequalities that we actually still undergo despite having higher levels of education, we're not in those spaces where we can actually navigate through those tiers. I'll end up with just a personal example. As you've known me, Congressman, for years, I'm in this new role at Brookings. Brookings is the world leading think tank. I'm in the process of writing a book, shameless plug. It's on the U.S. Digital Divide and it comes out later this year. But I have to tell you, people, my white male colleagues have said, well, Nicole, the best way to write your book is to get up at 4 a.m. and just start writing. But that means you got to go to bed at 9 p.m. because if you go to bed at 9, you'll be able to get up at 4. I'm like, well, who's going to cook the dinner? Who's going to make sure the clothes get folded? Who's going to tend to those needs? And I think we need to, as Black women, really start to reclaim our time in ways that allow us to express ourselves in these spaces because they are very time consuming in policy, as you know, but they're also, a loss of our voices if we can't manage and navigate through those processes like our male counterparts can. So I'm still trying to figure it out. And I'm still trying, I'm not up at 4, but maybe closer to 6. But I think that those are things that we need to always remember as Black women. We can break through these things, but they do exist and sometimes get in the way of us being all that we can be in these male dominated technology industries.
Well, thank you so much for breaking that down, Nicole. I think that you really built upon the lived experience of Commissioner Clyburn. She had to break down a lot of barriers in order to chair the FCC. And we can only imagine, because we've all experienced it in our own way, when you're in those type of leadership positions, the navigation that takes place, the word gymnastics, if you will, that has to take place in order for us to get our message across. And so I want to find out from Angela Ball, who will be our next panelist, what her experiences have been. We have Vice President of the Regulatory Affairs of the NBC Universal here with us, Ms. Angela Ball. Angela is a member of the Government Affairs team at NBC Universal, where she advises NBC-owned television stations, cable networks, and digital platforms on federal law and regulation impacting media and technology companies, including those enforced by the FCC and the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, relating to content and advertising standards, political broadcasting, children's programming, accessibility, closed caption, video descriptions, and station licensing. That's a lot of work. So I'm so glad that you've been able to join us today, Angela. As a Black woman in that space, can you, in your words, have you seen a lack of Black women in leadership roles in the private sector? And what, if anything, can be done to combat this?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Congresswoman Clark. First, I just want to say I'm so honored. I'm like Dr. Turner Lee, I'm having a fangirl moment. This is an amazing opportunity to be here with you all. Incredibly distinguished co-panelists. Congresswoman Clark, I proudly hail from the South Side of Queens, New York. So I grew up in the 5th Congressional District. And Black journalism and media has really always been a big part of my life. So my grandmother, a lot of people don't know this, my grandmother worked for Johnson Publishing Company in New York City for decades. And then I personally spent 7 years working as a lawyer for the legendary broadcaster, Kathy Hughes, and her son, Alfred Liggins, before my current role at NBC Universal. So, you know, there's no question that Black and Brown people have just, you know, experienced historical systemic discrimination that's really exacerbated our modern day experiences, whether it's educational disparities in our communities of color, to even right now, COVID-19 rates of infection and death. So I really appreciate all the work that all of you do in this space. And it's very personal to me, the idea of equity inclusion in the workplace, specifically in the tech industry. And as a broadcast media and technology lawyer, I can personally attest to the outstanding contributions that you've heard thus far from Commissioner Clyburn, as well as Dr. Turner Lee, and they just continue to shine a very needed, and of course, Congresswoman Clark continue to shine a very needed spotlight on these issues. So to answer your question, yes, for sure, there is definitely a shortage of Black women in the C-suite in corporate America. But certain industries like tech, I think, fare worse than others, right? And tech is the backbone of our country's economy. So we have to close this gap, right? You know, in terms of why it may not be obvious to everybody, I think a big problem, and Nicole's touched on these points, but I think one of the problems is that it starts with the lack of emphasis on STEM education in communities of color. So that STEM education can really help to build confidence to explore job opportunities in both new and emerging sectors. And it could also help advance the careers of professionals in other industries that play a role in the digital economy. For example, journalists. Journalists who study science and technology are better equipped to report on innovative and complex technological developments. As a lawyer, I need to have an understanding of these issues in order to draft a contract or to advise my client on the risks associated with making certain business decisions that impact the digital activities of the company. You know, earlier in my career in the late 90s, I worked for a law firm. And just by the way, there's only 1% of law firm partners in the United States who are Black women. That's a staggering statistic. But when I was at the law firm, I was exposed to technology issues and saw the opportunity to get involved in this emerging space. And from there, I was able to leverage this experience to work in privacy for the Federal Trade Commission, and then in-house as a broadcast lawyer, which is really my passion. And in that position, I drafted Radio One's first privacy policy, and later became the designated lawyer to assist with their then new interactive division. So at NBCU, I'm very fortunate to work for our very first African American female general counsel, and she spearheaded an internal training curriculum to help our team stay ahead of technology trends. And that was prior to the launch of our streaming platform last year in 2020. So that's something that employers really need to emphasize. And I think as Black professionals, we need to demand, right, training opportunities so that we can close those gaps. My company is also very fortunate to have Black women leaders in our newsrooms, like Rashida Jones, who was recently appointed to be the president of MSNBC, and Yvette Miley, who is a veteran journalist and currently the SVP of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for our news group. So I think to answer your question, Congresswoman Clark, how to combat this is that the private sector has to understand that this is a movement, not a moment. and realize the benefits of promoting Black women to these roles, and also the critical importance, like Nicole touched upon, appointing Black women to corporate boards so that their influence can travel from the top down and not just always, going against the current, which is what has been our experience in this country thus far.
Well, Angela, you've said a mouthful and all so true, but I want to push back on one notion, because when I came to Washington some 14 years ago, I immersed myself in the tech space and understanding the configuration of tech and how people are employed and what the challenges seem to be in that moment, because I knew tech was taking off and it's grown exponentially since then. And I kept hearing, we need to promote more in K through 12. We're going to make investments in K through 12. Well, if I came to Congress 14 years ago, we should have a bumper crop. And I really don't want our companies to continue to push that narrative when there are young people who are trainable, who are immersed in tech and are great STEM students and are involved in journalism, because that can be self-perpetuating. So I'm going to push back and I'm going to challenge, because I'm a member of a sorority and I know we have some kick-ass sisters looking for a job, STEM and everything else. And so there's not a dearth, I don't believe, of folks, but I think there's a dearth of opportunity.
Well, Congresswoman, I'm glad you brought that up, because my pushback on not a contradiction, but a pushback when it comes to the industry is, where are you looking? If you're looking only to the 1, 2, or 3 schools, that might have robust endowments, maybe I was not able to attend that school because I wanted to stay closer to home because I have family obligations. Has nothing to do with my ability, has nothing to do with my major even. Where are you looking? There are some incredible people coming out of HBCUs, out of state-supported schools that are not in that top 5 or 6 elite. And so, that to me is an issue. It's where they're looking, and they are not looking where the most qualified people of color are.
Well, I think that, these are the avenues and corridors that we have to navigate and that we have to open the aperture on. Because again, I just don't want it to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because like I said, I know that I've encountered some really excellent folks in tech, and their challenges, quite frankly, have more to do with who the investors are, more than the fact that they have the skill and ability. So let me ask a question to all of you women. As a Black woman in tech, what is the most sound advice that you've ever received? And I'm going to start with you, Nicole.
Yeah, look, I'm kind of in between this other conversation. I'm looking at both of you. I'm like, we can just stay right there. I think the sound advice that I've received, and this comes from people that I've really have pushed me into tech, Julia Johnson being one of those people, Mignon, Clyburn, really was, open the door and walk in. When you come into the tech industry and you go into tech policy like I work in, you work in think tanks, you're often not represented. There's no girlfriend for you to look for when you walk into that room. Years ago, there were 3 or 4 of us. Mignon can remember, we were kind of looking, are you there? Did you make it to the event? And, oftentimes we were sitting outside the door. We decided to just turn the car and go home because we were going to be by ourselves. What I would say to anybody that is actually trying to pursue this, you've got to walk in that door. Guess what? You may not have a lot in common with people, but you were supposed to be there. And I think the sound advice that I received was, when you are outside of the door, 2 things are not happening. One, they're not benefiting from your expertise, your creative genius that they need to hear, which is why every panel I do, I always refer back to people of color, because guess what? No one else is going to do it. But then 2, you need to walk in the door because you also have a seat at the table. As everybody on this panel can attest to, tech policy changes so quickly. There is no PhD for tech policy. It's about reading, listening, finding people like yourself, Congresswoman, getting engaged, and oftentimes going to these networking events where you are the only person and allowing people to share their knowledge and then putting your knowledge out there as well. So that was the biggest advice I received. I'll just never forget, oftentimes, I don't know if you remember just sitting outside, just trying to figure out who was at this tech policy event where it was predominantly white men and women, and you didn't want to go in. And I think, again, when I got that advice from my mentor, walk in, it's okay. There's no door that will ever be locked, closed, boarded up, that I'm not going to try to break down.
Wonderful. And what about you, Angela? What would you say was the soundest advice that you've ever received?
I would say short and sweet. Nicole already touched upon it, but read the news, read the industry press daily. I like to read Communications Daily, Politico Pro, technology newsletters. I like to read blogs from industry experts. There's just always a news cycle that you have to stay ahead of. Even in terms of being a corporate attorney, I have to follow the corporate trends and what the corporations are doing in terms of their new revenue models and that sort of thing. Just stay on top of the developments in the emerging areas, privacy, artificial intelligence. I think that will bode well if you truly have the interest, because I just want to follow up. I think that we need to be in a position to flood the pipeline, Congresswoman.
Gotcha.
Not just establish that we have folks, but really flood it, make it en vogue, make it the thing, the trend, and stay ahead of the trend, and not just to show that we have folks who are in this space, but really make it desirable and an opportunity to sustain and grow and flood that pipeline.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, Madam Commissioner, what would you say was the most sound advice you've ever received? And I know you got some great advisors.
I did. So I'll distill it in terms of how I interpreted that advice. I know each of us has been called a unicorn more than once.
Mm-hmm.
Being unique is a superpower. Unicorns are no longer bound by the laws of gravity. Once upon a time, that unicorn didn't have wings. We're not bound by that now. So I would say, and they have said to me, to transcend those boundaries, continue to transcend those boundaries, continue to be an innovator, a game changer. Embrace your unicornness, embrace that uniqueness, embrace what is you. Because if you do what you are capable of doing, they will follow you, not you following them.
Wow. You in answering that question, you actually answered the next question. And so I'm going to give you time to think, because you got to come up with some more nuggets. But I'm going to start with Angela this time and ask, what is the most sound advice you would impart to a young Black woman aspiring to achieve prominence in the tech industry? And you all kind of said it.
Yeah, taking a page from Commissioner Clyburn, bring your authentic self to the role that you perform. Don't feel, conformity is dull, it's status quo, it's boring, right? Our diversity of our backgrounds, of our experiences, of our opinions, that's what sparks innovation. And that's what helps to create holistic solutions, frankly, in society. It's always the outlier. Malcolm Gladwell wrote a book about outliers. It's saying, well, hey, wait a second, you're looking at it this way, but maybe you need to look at the problem this way, because this is my experience and this is what I have to bring to this discussion. And that can just generate a whole new flood of information and conversation to benefit the whole. And that's really what needs to happen with diversity and equity and inclusion, is making sure that it's benefiting not just those of us who have been historically marginalized, but the whole of society, really getting the benefit of what we all bring together.
Absolutely. And you, Madam Lee, what are your thoughts? What advice would you impart to a young Black woman aspiring?
So I often say it to a lot of young women of color, Black women in particular, some that work in your office, one. First and foremost, I want to say this, and I want to say this in the spirit of Black History Month. People have to be unapologetically Black. just be yourself. And I love what Angela talked about in being your authentic self. There is nothing wrong with who we are. And there's nothing wrong with actually carrying the torch that others have done before us, including yourself, Congresswoman, to be able to frame our questions around issues of concern to people of color, to Black people, to people who, remind you of your relatives at home who have very limited opportunity or have great opportunity, but cannot, get the capital to purchase a station or whatever the case may be. Be that person. Because I find that in the society that we live through now, we often wear this mask thinking that, a promotion and achievement equates with us being somebody different. And one of the things that we have to realize, particularly in the space of technology, is our difference, like the commissioner said, is the unicorn perspective. It is what is needed for these companies. Shame on them that they're not able to have the right places to find us. Shame on them that when we get there, and there's research that says this, that we're not welcomed or we don't fit the mold. You're not supposed to fit the mold, because guess what? Technology didn't fit the mold of any regulatory regime that we've ever had in this country and this world. And so I would just continue to say to Black women, it's okay to be who you are, and find people who respect who you are. And you will find in that evolution and growth that you will develop into this blossoming flower that has this ability to bring nuggets that just surpass everybody's wildest imagination of who you can be as a consummate professional going forward.
Very well. And Commissioner, was there something you'd like to add or impart to a young Black woman?
When you are told no, accept that as a blessing. Some of your best opportunities come after you've been turned down. A no does not mean forever, it means not now. The most phenomenal opportunities when we speak about the technology space, the most phenomenal opportunities are a result of failures. So never give up.
Wonderful, wonderful. And Commissioner, my final question, what technology trend and or policy are you most looking forward to under the Biden-Harris administration?
So Congresswoman, I hold out the most hope for this administration's stated focus on equity, that an equity agenda will no longer be viewed separately from an economic agenda, and that every single federal agency is supposed to take a baseline review and deliver an action plan within 200 days to address unequal barriers to opportunity when it comes to each agency's policies and programs. I have not heard that said. I am looking forward to that implemented, and that's where I hold the greatest hope when it comes to this administration.
And what about you, Angela? What technology trend and or policy are you most looking forward to under the Biden-Harris administration?
Well, I think that the most anticipated actions, at least talking to the folks that I work with on a daily basis by this administration, will relate to the reform of various laws that were drafted decades ago and have become antiquated by today's technology and business landscape. So that would include, and in some instances where there are no regulations, such as, with respect to governance of digital platforms, or maybe there may be issues with the parity in terms of the way that certain new coming platforms are regulated compared to, the traditional platforms who have been here. We've touched upon artificial intelligence, and then also very relevant to my company are reforms relating to copyright law. I think it's very hard. And I think particularly with Black creators, that's been a historical issue in terms of protecting their property. And I think while the internet has so many amazing benefits, the challenge is that your work can easily become eroded. And so how to preserve your copyright protection is important.
Absolutely. I'm taking notes. And Nicole Turner Lee, what technology trend and or policy are you most looking forward to under the Biden-Harris administration?
All right, Congressman, you got a long legal pad because I'm about to put it out there. No, actually, I want to put out some things that I've actually been writing about at Brookings, and I'm sure most people are familiar with. But if you're not, I'm going to do like Commissioner Clyburn and just use this as a moment to promote it. First and foremost, I think this administration has the opportunity to put together a tech new deal. and the Tech New Deal that recognizes the contributions of communities of color to the economic revitalization of this country. And so I've written about that, Congresswoman. It's really a combination of centering tech, so it's not ancillary in terms of the job creation that we're trying to do, the type of investments in startups that are from diverse founders, particularly Black founders, and our ability to close the digital divide. And so I think it's important for us to have a policy of Build Back Better that is centered on the universal deployment and adoption of technology. That also includes the fact that we should have a policy in place there that no child is left offline. And so we may talk about kids going back to school, but I think it's important, particularly for Black kids, that they are going to school, not necessarily, around the health provisions, but they're coming with a tablet, a portable hotspot, and whatever they need to be successful in the 21st century economy. And then I'll just close with this, and I'm sorry I had to ask three because, you're here listening and you are one of the most prominent folks that moves the agenda on these issues. But I would also say, like Commissioner Clyburn, center equity as we look at issues that affect tech policy, whether it's antitrust, whether it's algorithmic bias. We have this opportunity, as the Commissioner said, to begin to frame equity as a key determinant on consumer protection. And to me, I think if we actually combine those with the other things that have been said, we actually may have a chance in these next decade to have this equalization and democratization of the internet for Black people.
Wonderful. Well, ladies, you have really laid it down today, and I want to thank you for your time, your expertise, and your ability, and being such a stellar example of Black women excellence. Thank you, ladies, so much for all that you do and all that you are. And I look forward to continuing to work closely with you. I will be reaching out for your ideas. You know that myself and Congresswoman Kelly have been charged with leading a disparities working group. The other side to addressing disparity is equity. And so we're going to be doing a deep dive across the entire energy and commerce platform to ensure that we are advancing legislation that is reflective of closing those disparities and opening up the equities. Having said that, ladies, stay strong, stay healthy, stay proud, and stay blessed. And don't forget to wear your mask.